So next we're gonna have Dolors Armenteras. Dolors Armenteras is a researcher at the National University in Bogota, Colombia, the largest university in the country. She has been a researcher in Colombia for more than 1 decade, and she has been working on landscape dynamics at massive scales and has published a flurry of papers, literally something like 7 papers in the last 18 months, all examining landscape dynamics in the lowlands of Colombia, and more recently, she has delved into this issue of illicit crops and how much of an impact they have on the forest. So without any further ado, Dolores, take it away. Mike, okay, move to Mike.
Oh, I have it in my.
And now for some jokes.
This is.
It's still on you.
Oh. So everything I whispered to you there was. It's right onto YouTube.
They will edit.
Yeah, but they will become a different YouTube type video.
Right. Yeah, all right, that's good. See if we can catch that. Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Tony Brook, and thank you, Liliana, for inviting us to come to this symposium. If I may, Paul, I would add landscape ecologists, as also some of us scientists working on landscape ecology are adding or trying to do some research, some study on illicit crops. I'm an associate professor at the National University in Colombia. I work in Colombia, from Colombia, with Colombian resources, and with all the Colombian problems and benefits of being in Colombia at the same time. I don't work in Coca. I really came to study some Coca-related issues just by chance. I mean, I was not really focusing on that. What I do is, as a landscape ecologist in Colombia, is mainly work on land use and land cover change. And of course, coca cultivation is something that happens in the landscape. So that's why or how I came to cross with the coca issues. As you know, land use is the result of an interaction of biophysical, economical, technical, social, institutional, cultural factors that happen at a place in a moment and have some different spatial and temporal scales. And mainly deforestation and fragmentation in the landscapes are the result of what humans that are on the landscape do on a place. No? So my main interest is in land use, land cover change, deforestation, and fragmentation in the landscape. You may know these figures. Latin America is not the continent or the region with the highest deforestation rate, but it does have a pretty important deforestation rate of 0.5% annual rate. Comparing it with Southeast Asia, it's lower. If you compare it with Africa, surprisingly, Latin America has a higher deforestation rate than South Africa, than the African continent. And of course, there are many drivers that drive what happens on landscape. There are all these studies at the global level that say certain things, and then when you look at Latin America, the beef consumption is the main driver of deforestation, and then you look at the local level and there's something else happening. So that's why I focus at the local scales in a country like Colombia. And we do study some patterns of what happened, why it's happening, and what implications we think might have in the landscape and in the environment. And we're hoping that in the future we can add some or give some information for decision making at the landscape level and for planning the landscapes in countries like ours. Just to let you know, my group works in the whole country. We actually have been mainly focusing on the Andes and the Amazon in the last few years, but we also had work in the Caribbean and in the Pacific area, and even in the Orinoco Basin. Colombia has everything. It has mountains, it has Caribbean, it has deep jungle, it has Amazon jungle. For the last 10 years, we've focused a little bit on the northwestern part of the Amazon basin that belongs to Colombia. We've been trying to answer or focusing on these 4 questions, whether there are difference on what's happening in the regions, within the regions. How do social, economic, land use, and other physical, biophysical factors influence land use, land cover change in the country? How are the interactions between the patterns that we detect at the landscape level and the processes that happen in the landscape? And something that we also do or look is how effective are conservation strategies to reducing deforestation and fragmentation. So as you see, so far I have not mentioned Coca at all. So that's what I do. In 2005, we did a study in the Amazon, and we were comparing the deforestation and fragmentation trends of the Amazon forest in the Colombian Amazon. And suddenly we started finding in the landscape these holes, small holes somewhere, and we just were not sure what it was and why it had happened. And then we found out that it was probably related to illicit crops in some of the areas. And that's how we contact the people from the UN to try to find out if we were right, if what was going on in some of the regions was related to Coca or was not related to Coca. Surprisingly enough, till this time, there was not much information about what was going on in the Amazon, in the Colombian Amazon. And they didn't even know we didn't even know if there was deforestation happening there, or there were no rates, or we didn't know how many hectares had been lost. So that was a bit of the beginning. We further studied at regional level. We took 4 different types of occupation models in the area in the Amazon. One area that it's more indigenous. There's indigenous people located. Want to look at how the landscape pattern was when there was indigenous people on it. We also look at colonies frontier to see how the pattern in the landscape looked when you were in a place where colonies go and extract the natural resources, and it's a very fast changing landscape. It changes very fast. We looked at what we called colonies to permanent settlement transition. So it was not colonies, there was not established settlements yet, but it was in the transition between becoming colonies frontier to a place where people settle. So to look at the pattern like this. And we also looked to places where there was already people established and roads and some kind of minimum infrastructure developed in the region. And we analyzed the deforestation trends and patterns. And we went further. We went down the scale and we looked at some local dynamics. This is one of the last works we've done, the last study where we established 300 3 by 3 kilometers plots. And we analyzed what was going on there in the landscape, how the forest and how the deforestation was happening. We looked at some what we call forest mosaics, where these 3 by 3 9 square kilometers was mainly forest. We looked at some areas where there was a lot of pastures, and we also looked at some areas that had a lot of illicit crops in these 3 by 3 kilometers. And plus the use of fire. The use of fire as a management tool in the area is very important. So we looked at that and tried to find out and do how you say that, time series of what was going on landscape. And the first line you see forest mosaics, and the second line is an area where initially there was a lot of fires. A lot of pastures. The third one is fires. The fourth one is a place or an example of a place where there was a lot of illicit crops in the 2000 year as a start line, and we follow it over the time, like 10-year series of that. We do look also at demographics, socioeconomics, land use, biophysical factors. So we don't only look at the landscape as itself, but we try to understand what's going on a landscape. If you see in the region, there's a deforestation rate of 0.25, which is half of what's going on in America Latina, in Latin America. So it's not as high. In fact, where there's indigenous people, the deforestation rate is very low. So it's areas where there's not much landscape change. The colonization frontier is areas where there's not so high deforestation rate. Transition zones is much higher, and where there's been a settlement establishment, deforestation rates are really high in comparison to what's going on. So that's where the landscape change is being very fast. What we found out is there's a lot of intact forest, well-preserved areas of forest, but there's a increasingly worrying percentage of forest that is becoming fragmented, and this has a lot of implications for biodiversity, conservation, and provision of ecosystem services, and all these related things. One of the interesting things we've found out in this area is that in the last 10 years, illicit crops have reduced considerably at an annual change rate of negative 11% per year, but both the use of fire and pastures have considerably increased. So there's a lot of transition towards the illicit crops are disappearing, pastures are becoming every time more and more common in the area. So wherever there's deforestation is more related to the pastures conversion than other things. Another interesting thing that you can see down there is that there's a lot of conversion from illicit crops that are abandoned that become forest, regenerate to forest. And much more, half of it in these 10 years have become pastures. Also, illicit crops are abandoned or were abandoned in this region and become pastures. So pastures, something is going on in the landscape with pastures. Pastures are becoming more and more abundant. There's still a lot of forest, but there's every time there's more and more pastures appearing in this region. And the use of fire is one of the things I wanted to look, and I thought initially that fire was used to prepare the land for illicit crops, but we couldn't detect that. We could detect a lot of fire used for pastures conversion, and no matter whether you were in an area that was mostly forest or whether you were in an area where there was more pastures, fire is consistently being used, and that's one of our subject of studies. And regarding conservation strategies, although protected areas and indigenous reserves don't have high deforestation rates, they do have, and they do have illicit crops inside of them. So that's something else we looked at, and we looked whether there had been changes in deforestation rates inside the protected areas or around the protected areas, and if there was something that was related with illicit crops or was not related to illicit crops. And we found out that yes, there is some around protected areas, especially there's some relationship between roads presence, infrastructure development, and the presence of illicit crops and the deforestation rates of what was happening there. So far, what do we know? If we know something, I don't know about what's going on in this landscape, is that there are big intra-regional differences. You cannot generalize from one region to another. There's a lot of importance that has to be given to accessibility, pastures conversions, and population displacement as the factors of deforestation in the region. Pastures conversion is the main factor causing deforestation. It's not illicit crops, it's not other things, it's the conversion of forest to pastures. This region was strongly influenced by illicit crops for a long time, and there was a lot of big dynamics going on in the landscape for a long time, but in the past, nowadays, most of the original illicit crops are or have been converted to pastures, so most of them are today pastures rather than illicit crops. But do illicit crops have an impact on the landscape? Yes, they do. In somehow, they move from. They have disappeared in extension. They are less and less fragments of illicit crops, but they still are, and they're appearing inside the forest and moving farther into the forest. So there is some kind of impact regarding forest fragmentation. Fire is used a lot in the region as a management technique to use as a method of preparing soil, especially for pastures and for getting cows into this land. And the region has moved from a pattern of colonization, initially arriving to a place, to now an occupation site. The settlements are being established, urbanization is happening, and large livestock is arriving to the area, or a lot of cows are arriving to this area. Do we have new questions? We have a lot of questions. Anytime we look at a place, we sort of like answer something and 10 other new questions arise. One of the things we want to know is why there has been this strong pasture conversion in this area. Are there other economic alternatives? What happens with the people there? We want to understand how the pattern that happens in the landscapes affects the provision of ecosystem services. We want to know whether the transitions that are happening, the land use transitions, are due to socio-ecological feedbacks, or is this a socioeconomic change happening in the area, and trying to find out and explain all these type of things. More ecological questions that we do have is whether there is forest degradation due to the pasture conversion, but also the illicit crops getting farther into the forest, whether there is an edge effect, and the landscape connectivity gets affected when there is this process of occupation in the land. We don't know anything about the effects on wildlife of what's going on. We don't know whether there's a displacement of fauna. There's been some comments about old Coca labs, abandoned Coca labs converted into new artificial salt licks where animals go and get some minerals, extra minerals, so we don't know if that's really happening. And probably there are many other questions that we can discuss and you might have, or we can find out. But this is the kind of work we do. As I said, we don't really focus on illicit crops, but because illicit crops are part of the landscape, it came to our research by sight. How would you say that? I don't know. So this is what I wanted to show you, really. It was, I know it's another perspective, it's another look, it's another scale, but I hope that you think about the landscape from now on. Thank you.